Okay, Ani. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second annual Student Science Indigenous Scientist Chats series. My name is Amber Sandy, and I'm the coordinator of Indigenous Knowledge and Science Outreach for Student Science. And if this is your first time hearing about us, we are a subsidiary initiative launched out of Ryerson University's SciExchange program in 2019. Our objective has been to promote science outreach, science knowledge, mobilization, and knowledge translation combined with traditional Indigenous teachings to Indigenous students. Throughout the years, myself and our Indigenous research assistant, Jenna Barnhart, have been working hard to offer science outreach programming specifically to Indigenous communities and youth. If you're interested in hearing more about our past and future programming, you can find us all on all social media platforms under @SciExchangeRU or on our website, www.ryerson.ca/SciExchange. And for today's program, we've been graciously able to partner with our friends at Let's Talk Science to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jessie Popp, to talk to us today about her research. Dr. Popp is a member of Wiikwemkoong First Nation and is currently a professor at the University of Guelph. I will let her tell you more about her background and experience. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Popp.
Ani, hello everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Amber, for that introduction. And I'm just going to try to share my screen here now. Okay, can you see that, Amber? Okay, perfect. So I'll start with saying, Ani, ezongede e kata kwa kwe, Indigenous cause, Wiikwemkoong Donjaba, Makwa Dodum, Anishinaabe and Dao Miigwech. Hi everyone, I was just introducing myself in Anishinaabe. And in English, my name is Jessie Popp. As Amber said, I'm a member of Wiikwemkoong Unceded Territory, and I am a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Science at the University of Guelph. So today I'm going to be sharing with you insights on weaving ways of knowing in wildlife ecology. And I'm going to gear my presentation to high school students, I guess, to talk about how exciting wildlife ecology and Indigenous environmental science can be, and sort of share with you my journey. To start off, to tell you all a little bit more about myself, I mentioned I'm a member of Wiikwemkoong, but I did not grow up in the community. I grew up in Northern Ontario, so in the Sudbury area. I am Anishinaabe on my mother's side and mixed European heritage on my father's side. And growing up sort of had a foot in two cultural worlds, sometimes seeing things through an Indigenous lens and sometimes seeing things through sort of a Western or Eurocentric lens. So I am a wildlife ecologist, and I went to school in the natural sciences and biology. And for the most part, I work with a lot of large mammal species like this caribou here in the background, but I also work with wolves and bear and deer, elk, moose, and even more. And more my work is becoming more holistic because, as we know, everything is interconnected. So today I want to share with you sort of my journey in wildlife ecology and Indigenous environmental science, and hopefully get some people excited in this field and the really awesome work that you can do. So I did mention that growing up, I was sort of part of two cultural worlds, but that's not what I was exposed to in high school and university. That is changing, but for me and many others in the past, Eurocentric or Western education systems dominate, and of course still dominate today, but we are starting to see change. But back when I was in school, I wanted to know why I wasn't seeing Indigenous knowledge systems perspectives in the sciences. And so I wanted to be part of change as I was learning this. So I decided to embark on a journey of learning. So in my own journey of learning, I guess things kind of started with learning a bit more about the history in these lands, also known as North America, but known to many Indigenous nations as Turtle Island. And this is just a figure I found online showing this land, also known as North America, but showing how you can sort of see that it's shaped as a turtle. So this land, also known as North America, is called Turtle Island by some nations, but not all. It's important to note that there are hundreds of distinct Indigenous nations on these lands. And Indigenous peoples have lived for millennia on this land, harvesting, engaging in agriculture, having incredibly strong relationships with nature, founded in respect, and in fact, the first scientists on these lands. So Indigenous peoples, being the first scientists on Turtle Island, have been responsible for so many contributions to science and technology. So here's just a few examples, and I only have time to just share a couple with you, but there are so many incredible examples. On this slide here, we can see the canoe. The birch bark canoe was innovated by Indigenous people, which was quickly adapted by European settlers. Snowshoes, for example, and different kinds of snowshoes, depending on the environment. Moccasins, for example, the parka, which was innovated by Inuit people and is actually like one of the pretty much the warmest outerwear that you can have. So plant foods, the science of domestication. Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island began domesticating plants around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And today, 3/5 of the crops now in cultivation were domesticated by Indigenous people in North, Central, and South America. Many, many species you can imagine of plant foods, because we have such a large variety, but a few examples here are corn, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, even chocolate and coffee were domesticated by Indigenous people. And not just plant foods, but agricultural techniques. So in that upper right corner there, you can see that's actually a depiction of the Three Sisters, which is a polyculture, or a way to grow plants together to increase productivity. So corns, beans, and squash grow together, helping one another grow and increasing productivity. So many scientific innovations, technologies, plant foods, and even the science of medicines, for example. So plant medicines in particular are, there are many plant medicines known to Indigenous people and have made substantial contributions in general. So I have two examples here. One plant is on the left is a willow tree. So Indigenous people historically and still today use the bark of the willow tree as a pain reliever, along with other medicinal properties. When Europeans and so settlers arrived, they, through engaging with Indigenous people, eventually determined through Western science that it was acetylsalic acid is the compound that's responsible for pain relief. And it was then synthesized into what we now use as aspirin. So if you've ever had an aspirin, it originated from Indigenous science. The branch that you see on the right there is a pine tree branch. And pines are very full of vitamin C. You can make a tonic or a tea with pine needles, and they're very full of vitamin C. Now, when settlers were arriving in North America, they were coming across seas by boats, and a lot of the times didn't have all the nutrients and the vitamins they needed to make that journey. So some people would arrive with vitamin deficiencies like scurvy if you don't have enough vitamin C, and that can actually be life-threatening. So Indigenous people recognize these signs and shared tonics of pine needle teas, and we're actually able to help heal people. So of course, many, many more medicines than this today, and many more scientific contributions. And for thousands and thousands of years, Indigenous peoples lived on Turtle Island, engaging in science. And Christopher Columbus, which many of you may have learned about, sort of stumbled across the Americas in 1492. So some people thought that Christopher Columbus discovered America, but of course we know that was wrong and incorrect, because people were already here. Around the time Christopher Columbus arrived, natural resources were very exploited in Europe. Land was scarce and overworked. So when people first arrived in these lands, sort of saying that it was a new world, sort of saw things as maybe the Garden of Eden, a lush, vibrant environment full of animals and plants, and the Garden of Eden just being a place described in the book, the Bible, about as a place that has a very lush environment. So people wanted to come and to see this sort of new world, is what Europeans had called these lands, and take advantage of, experiencing a new place, but also the vast, what people thought of as resources that were there. And there were so many plants and animals. This is just artist rendering of an explorer being shown the fields of the plains and seeing buffalo. European explorers like Henry Kelsey described seeing buffalo as far as the eye could see. There was actually once 60 million buffalo in the plains of Turtle Island. Many other species, like for example, the passenger pigeon, were so copious. There were so many of them. And people said they saw neither the beginning nor ending, the length or breadth of these millions and millions of birds. And they were in such great measure that they obstructed the light of day, so they would cast a shadow. And so as Europeans were arriving, as settlers were arriving, they were harvesting species that they saw. They thought, well, there's so many, we'll just, harvest them and make a better way of life here. So they started hunting, and that's actually where the saying came from: two birds with one stone. So when you say that saying, I'm gonna do two birds with one stone, you're saying I'm going to do two things with one action. But that saying actually came from the passenger pigeon, because there were so many of them that you could, take one shot or throw a stone and you could actually get two birds because there were so many. These are actually they're extinct today because of their overharvest. So in Stephen Crush's book, he says that other Europeans were awestruck by North America's natural world. They labored to describe what they had encountered. Never had they seen birds or other animals in such profusion. Fish and shellfish so large, or forests so expansive, trees towered above them, producing prodigious quantities of nuts, berries, extensive beds of shellfish, blanketed estuaries and shorelines. Fish schooled, spawned, or beached themselves in countless numbers. Birds darkened the sky and eclipsed the sun, and life teemed. So these are historical accounts. So you could just imagine what the land might have looked like before all these roads were and highways and railways and farmland. It's a very different environment. And so with this lush new world, people saw, or what people thought was a new world, of course, being a home to Indigenous people for millennia, but settlers saw opportunities for profit, and began to hunt, fish, trap, build, and more people settled in these lands. And overharvest started to happening. And overharvest is when people use too much of something, and a population, for example, can't bounce back. So unsustainable use. So shortly after settlers were arriving, the fur trade started. So this is where animal furs were traded for objects like, for example, weapons or cooking materials and so on. So the fur trade started. Animal furs were used for fashion. So for example, the beaver pelt was highly prized, and people would wear beaver fur for hats, and more people came to try to take advantage. So animals weren't just used for fashion and food by settlers, and historically, and still today, animals are very respected by Indigenous peoples, and often as a sign of respect, we use every part of the animal. In the plains, for example, Indigenous peoples of the plains still today, buffalo are very, very important. And buffalo could provide everything that, most things that people needed in the plains. So, providing food, providing shelter through hides, providing tools through bones, for example, very, very important and important to the culture. So as settlers arrived and originally maybe using buffalo for meat, eventually started killing buffalo just for their hides. And it was actually a form of cultural assimilation. Oops. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, but once Europeans arrived, there was an attempt to assimilate Indigenous people, as it was thought that Indigenous people were inferior or to Western society and needed to be assimilated to be more civilized, which of course was very wrong. And part of doing that was to take away way of life. And again, with Indigenous people very reliant upon buffalo, taking away that source could change way of life. So there was a lot of overharvest with buffalo. This picture just shows an image of buffalo hides piled up from all the buffalo that were killed and just the hides being taken. This next image here shows this is a mountain of buffalo skulls. So it gives you a sense of just how many buffaloes were killed in a short amount of time, and just being the skulls. And these bones here were brought to a fertilizing plant, which you can see in the background as they would then be used for fertilizing. So a lot of animal populations started declining with this overuse and extinctions. For example, like the passenger pigeon occurred, extirpation, so removing species from historical range, and habitat was being lost more and more as people came to the New World. Now, as substantial overharvest occurred, many Indigenous peoples could not hunt the way historically used to be able to, because animals were getting fewer and fewer. And so in some instances, like in this photo here, people would have to roam the plains and collect bones that were left behind to bring to fertilizing plants in exchange for canned food. So I learned a lot about the history of Canada, which I particularly wasn't taught in school. So I had to learn that on my own, hear from my family, and dig in and do research. But I think today that again, that's changing. But when I'm learning about the history of Canada and the very first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald in 1885, so I found out that he said the great aim of our legislation, so of Canada's legislation, has been to do away with the tribal system, assimilate Indian or Indigenous people in all respects with the other inhabitants of Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. So again, Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing, knowledge systems, culture was thought of as inferior. And it was with this thinking that universities and school systems in Canada were founded. So founded in Eurocentric or Western worldview. And of course, I think most of us know now in our education systems about residential schools, so forcefully taking children and placing them in school, in these schools founded in Western worldview to assimilate children. And of course, we've, if anyone has been listening, we've had over 10,000 children found buried in just a fraction of the residential schools that existed in Canada. So there was quite a lot of abuse in a very, very horrific history. So that's what I was learning about. This very hard to hear, hard to learn about history, but it was so important to learn that. And it's important for all Canadians to learn that history of colonization in the lands also known as Canada. Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems, ways of knowing, once considered inferior or uncivilized, but that is wrong. We can coexist, and everyone's worldview, knowledge system, and way of living and knowing is equally valid and important. And we need to engage in reconciliation. All people's ways of knowing and knowledge systems are equally important. And so I think it's really, really important to learn about the history so we can ensure that we work towards righting the wrongs of the past, making sure that we work together to move ahead in a good way in the future. As one place to start, this is a really excellent book. It's 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, written by Bob Joseph, an Indigenous author. And he also talks about helping Canadians make reconciliation with Indigenous people a reality. And just a note on reconciliation, we are all, every single one of us, important actors in reconciliation. So that was part of my learning journey. So learning about the history, and then as a scientist, thinking about, well, how does this relate to the natural sciences? So when I was in graduate school, so after university, after my bachelor, I went into graduate school and I started learning a little bit more and doing sort of what I knew best, what I was trained to do as a scientist was to, investigate, do research, look into literature. And I came across these terms: traditional ecological knowledge or knowledges, indigenous knowledge system, Aboriginal traditional knowledge, many, many terms, essentially meaning indigenous knowledge about the environment or ecosystems passed down through generations by indigenous people, and for the most part, orally. So these terms, I think, meaning Gikan, which is Anishinaabemowin for knowledge of the earth. Now, traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge systems were, I think, largely recognized as that environmental knowledge passed down through generations, which indigenous knowledge systems definitely are, but they are so much more. Indigenous knowledge systems are a way of life, holding original instructions for how to relate with all of creation. So indigenous knowledge systems are intrinsically tied to worldview. And Raymond Periotti says that an individual's worldview, or the way that individual sees the world, has a major impact on the way that he or she interprets it. Now, it's important to note that worldview can differ among cultures, among nations, among communities, among families, and among individuals. And like I said before, in these lands, also known as Canada or Turtle Island, there are hundreds of distinct nations with distinct cultures, distinct knowledge systems, and traditions. However, there tend to be similarities among many indigenous philosophies. So now you can imagine with having differences in worldviews, or the way you see the world can impact the way not only the way you interpret, but the way you understand the world, the environment, and how your relationships form. So yeah, so just a note on diversity. So Leroy Littlebear, who's the founding director of Harvard University's Native American program, said that given Canada's cultural and linguistic diversity, it is foolish to suggest that a single Native perspective exists. Yet there are unique ways of understanding events that have demonstrated to me and others that there are culturally specific ways of appreciating what we may have previously considered to be universally accepted ideas. So there are these sort of cultural, especially among many indigenous philosophies, similarities. So for example, understanding that, or recognizing that, we really need to prioritize our relationship with the earth, recognizing that, well, actually, I'll talk about that in a minute. So there are several ways of describing seeing through multiple lenses to better understand the world among Indigenous nations. And one of those is Wiikwemkoong, which is Mi'kmaq for two-eyed seeing. Now, Wiikwemkoong or two-eyed seeing is a concept coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall from Unama'ki, or Cape Breton. And Elder Albert Marshall teaches us that you can better understand the world or the environment, for example, by seeing through two lenses. One with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing, for example, and another with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, for example, or multiple lenses. So the idea is that if you're seeing the world a little bit different, understanding or relating to the world a little bit differently, that you're seeing complementary views. One way of seeing the world or way of knowing the world might be a little bit different than somebody else's way of knowing or seeing the world. So you might have complementary viewpoints, and in a sense, when you're seeing with multiple ways of seeing, you're getting a better picture, a more holistic picture, and a better understanding of the world or the environment for the benefit of all. Now, there are many examples in the natural sciences about, showing researchers that have taken a two-eyed seeing or embraced multiple ways of knowing in the work that they do. I'm going to share a couple with you today, but if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend you go start digging around doing research, because there's really some awesome work out there. So this is one of my favorite examples, and it's about beluga whales. And a researcher, Henry Huntington, who all the way back in 1998 wanted to do a beluga whale ecological research study and wanted to learn just more about beluga whale ecology in general, factors related to population declines, diet, and things like that. So Huntington said that he actually wanted to hear insights from elders as well. And he said he started talking to one elder, who are individuals within Indigenous communities who harbor vast amounts of knowledge, very respected in communities. And so chatting with one elder, he said this elder went off on a tangent, actually talking about beavers. Beavers this and beavers that. And as we know, beavers are a freshwater species, where beluga whales are marine, they live in the ocean. So he said, I had to at least steer the conversation back to the ocean. And he tried to do that. But the elder said, wait, don't you see? As beaver numbers increase, they dam up more rivers, which affects the fish because now the fish can't reach their spawning grounds, which affects fish populations, which ultimately affects beluga whales because beluga whales depend on those fish. And he said, I would have never anticipated a connection between beaver and beluga. So one of the really awesome things about Indigenous knowledge systems is they're often very holistic. So understanding the environment as a whole, being very interconnected and in balance. Whereas Western science often views things in a reductionist approach, which just means breaking things down into smaller components. So for example, having wildlife ecology or entomology, which is the study of insects, or forest ecology, marine ecology, which is also very important because when you break things down into smaller parts like that, you can become like really experts in certain things and really know a lot about something little. But then sometimes you miss those connections as a whole. So can you see how complementary two different viewpoints might be, especially here for understanding beluga whale ecology? Another example here, which is a really cool one, is about wildlife monitoring. This is an example all the way back from the 1970s, and it was in around Alaska, where scientists wanted to do a bowhead whale population survey. So they wanted to determine how many bowhead whales were in the area. So they did their survey, and they found that there were less than 1,000 whales in this region, which was very alarming. This meant that the population had dropped substantially, and so alarming that the International Whaling Commission put a moratorium on hunting, so people could no longer hunt for bowhead whales. But Inuit elders thought, what the heck? What do you mean less than 1,000? We think there's closer to 7,000. So they actually got to chatting with scientists, and science sat down and they listened, and the elders shared their knowledge. And they said, it looks like in your surveys, you don't take into account the fact that whales do swim under the ice and they do feed during migration. So the scientists decided to embrace this knowledge that was shared with them, redesign their population surveys, redo their survey, and they found that there was closer to 8,000 whales. And they said this is an affirmation of the ecological knowledge held by individuals who depended on whales for food, fuel, and shelter. And one last really cool example, this one comes from coastal British Columbia. And it was back, I think around 2014 was when it was, I think published in CBC, yeah, 2014. So elders of the Heiltsuk First Nation approached scientists and said, there's two types of wolves that we have here, right? Coastal and inland wolves. And at first researchers were like, what? And so they decided to, being a bit apprehensive at first, decided to look into this a little bit more. And they found out, yes, there definitely was two types of wolves. You had your inland wolves, which were your typical wolves, large in body size, long legs, because wolves need these long legs because they're chasing after prey like deer, for example. And these inland wolves had your typical diet like deer and other animals. But then you had these coastal wolves, which kind of hung around the beaches, were smaller in body size. They tended to eat things that wolves don't typically tend to eat, things like salmon, mussels, clams, not your typical wolf behavior. So with more investigation by researchers, they found that not only were wolves morphologically distinct, behaviorally distinct, but they found that these wolves were also genetically distinct, so much so that they now require their own separate management plans. And Chris Darramount from the University of Victoria said that for him, the most exciting part of the work is how science and Indigenous knowledge, even though they can use very different approaches, can often point to the same conclusions. So some really great examples. And while I was learning about all this, I said, holy geez, we really need to listen more. Western science needs to listen more to multiple perspectives to take this two-eyed seeing approach. And more than just listen, we need to work together reciprocally and responsibly. So Jessie Wente, who's an Anishinaabe journalist and chairperson for the Canada Council of Arts, has once at a presentation said, that I was lucky enough to join, said, in thinking about inclusion and diversity, think of a forest. Is there one kind of tree? No, that tells us that the natural way is diverse. The natural way is to be diverse, and we can make science better by being inclusive, by being diverse, by embracing multiple ways of knowing. And we should always think about doing that. We should always think about equity, diversity, inclusion. But it is so important, especially given, the headlines that we've been seeing over the past decades. This actually was one of the headlines all the way back in 2018, and it was from a World Wildlife Fund report. And this report said that humans have caused 60% in wildlife population decline from 1970 to 2014. So more than half the world's wildlife population has died off, and the vast majority of those losses coming from human activity. The report said that Earth is losing biodiversity at a rate seen only during mass extinctions. And USA Today wrote an article on this report, and an individual shared that we can be the founders of a global movement that changed our relationship with the planet, that saw a secure future for all life on Earth, including our own. Or we could be a generation that had its chance, failed to act, and let it slip away. We need to work now together, respectfully, reciprocally, for all our relations, for all the plants, for the animals, and for ourselves. So this journey of learning that I was on, it came to a point where I said, no, I've learned quite a bit, and I really want to start sharing what I've learned. This is important. This is, I think, something we really need to do. And so I started sharing what I had learned. And, at first, because our systems are have been founded in Western ways of knowing, our academic institutions, it wasn't easy, sharing what I learned with, some of my colleagues, maybe even, teachers. And some people even had opposition, saying like, oh, there's, this is not something that you should be pursuing, telling me that I just couldn't do it. But I could. So after I was in school, I got hired on as a professor, and I started a wildlife Indigenous science ecology lab. And in this lab, we work with First Nation communities across Canada, addressing environmental issues that are important to them and working together, weaving ways of knowing, or taking this two-eyed seeing approach to better understand ecology and to work together to protect the environment and some of these animals that are in jeopardy. And so I just want to share with you like how cool this sort of work can be, and how my experience has been so far. And it's absolutely amazing. And I highly encourage anyone who's thinking about engaging in this type of work to go for it, no matter what stands in your way, because it's not actually in your way. You can achieve anything that you put your mind to. So in the WISE lab that I have, we have such an incredible team of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students working together, respecting each other's ways of knowing. We spend a lot of time with communities building relationships, because it's so important to build relationships with partners and with each other. So here we are in Magnetawan First Nation swimming in the river, which was really great time. And we work with such a wide variety of partners, incredible people, communities, organizations. And here are just some of our partners. So I personally work for the University of Guelph, but we work with Nature United, which is a nonprofit organization. We work with Shawanaga First Nation, for example, Magnetawan First Nation, Wiikwemkoong Unceded Territory, Indigenous organizations like Wakatoa Development, universities like Laurentian Universities, UBC, York University, and then government like Environment and Climate Change Canada, the provincial government. So such a wide variety of people that you can work with in this field. And so all the work we do, I think I mentioned a few times, doing things in a good way or proceeding in a respectful way with reciprocity. So with everything we do, we ensure we are prioritizing doing things in a good way. In the past, researchers have, that have saw, the value of Indigenous knowledge systems in the work, have tried to extract from communities, have tried to take knowledge from communities, have not engaged in meaningful relationships. So things weren't good in the past, and sometimes still aren't, but things are changing and things are getting better. So talking about doing things in a good way, I often like using a metaphor of a braid of sweetgrass. Sweetgrass is an important sacred medicine to Anishinaabe peoples, which you can see here. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's an Anishinaabe author and scholar, wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which is the best book I've ever read. And I highly encourage you to get a copy if you haven't already read it. But she uses a braid of sweetgrass as a different metaphor in her book. But I like to use it for something a little bit different. So when thinking about a braid, imagine you have two strands, one representing Indigenous ways of knowing, another one representing Western ways of knowing. And imagine trying to braid those together. You braid them together and then when you let go, what will happen? That braid will just unravel. You need a third strand. You need to ensure that you are braiding in, weaving, ensuring that you are doing things in a good way. Now, what does in a good way mean? It can mean many different things. It can differ among nations, for example, communities. But for example, always ensuring that you're prioritizing respect, reciprocity, and responsibility in everything that you do. So I mentioned that I work a lot with wildlife, and I'll share a quote with you here about all my relations from Herman Mischel, who is an Indigenous scholar. He says that Indigenous philosophies are based on foundations of respect for all ways of knowing. So I mentioned that Indigenous philosophies, although very different, there are some similarities. So he says that although we have diverse knowledge systems, we are all related and we honor each other's ways. The respect we have for all our relations, so human and non-human, so everyone deserves respect, even our plants and animals. And this is based on a philosophy of coexistence and the inherent responsibilities and obligations involved in maintaining relationships. So relationships are so important. And when we say all my relations, we recognize and understand that all those plants, all those animals, that all of us together as humans, we are all related. And seeing wildlife and plants, for example, as our kin, as our brothers, as our sisters, and not as a resource, something that we can use as what Western society tends to view things sometimes. So working with all my relations has been super fun. I love being out on the land, and my job gets me out on the land quite a bit for anyone who likes being out in the forest, for example. I learned how to use a lot of different equipment through the years, one being an ATV, which you can see, this is one of the first pictures I had learning how to do an ATV, and quickly I got stuck. So there's the ATV with all the wood there that I was trying to get out. But I definitely learned a lot and learned how to not be stuck all the time. So I'm doing what I love now. I'm contributing to reconciliation. I'm contributing to conservation. I'm getting out and spending time on the land, using equipment like ATVs, for example, out there with snow machines in the winter. So here, this was actually this winter, I was out tracking with Wiikwemkoong Unceded Territories, species at risk biologist, Elder Theodore Flamond. We were looking for wolves. We were actually, so here we are, we found some wolf tracks because we're interested in learning more about wolf spatial movements and behaviors and finding out, who's in a pack and how many are in a pack. And also species at risk, as the eastern wolves are an at-risk species. I've also been explored things by air. And so this is actually this winter too, heading out with Elder Theodore Flamond. We are working with Magnetawan First Nation, Shawanaga First Nation, and Wiikwemkoong Unceded Territory in partnership with the provincial government to work together to understand wolf ecology. And we actually used helicopters to collar them, so to put collars on them so we could track their movements. And what's really cool about this project, because this project definitely, of course, weaves knowledge systems, we chatted with Indigenous community members who are very familiar with the land and who have these relationships with wolves, who were able to tell us exactly where to go look for wolves so that we could put these collars on. So really exciting stuff. And so I don't just work with wolves, but I've worked with so many different animal species. This is just a few examples of some of the species that I get on my trail cameras. So we use trail cameras and get to places out in the bush. This particularly for a project on railway ecology, which I'm actually going to elaborate on a little bit in a minute. But you know, red fox, elk, moose, wolves, bear, and these are all in the region of Ontario. And I've seen, you know, a lot of cool, I've had many cool wildlife experiences. This is an elk, which is actually one found in Ontario. This photo, it's such a good photo, so I had to include it. It was by my friend, David McGeechee. All the rest of the photos are ones that I took, but yeah, I actually did my PhD on elk, and elk are a species that were also impacted by those wildlife species population declines that we talked about, that I just spoke about. You can see in this light gray area on this map here of Turtle Island that elk used to range across most of Turtle Island. So that's where they used to live. And then you see all these darker shades, that's where elk live now. That's where you can find elk. So when Europeans arrived, there was thought to be about 10 million elk. But by the late 1800s, they were extirpated or disappeared from the east. By 1970, there were only 500,000 elk left, which was a 95% reduction. So elk actually found refuge in mountains. It was harder terrain, harder for people to follow and hunt them. So that's why you see that sort of, you know, cluster of dark over there by the mountains in the west. So you see all these little pockets of dark gray in the east, those are actually elk reintroductions. So people, scientists took elk from the west where they were left and reintroduced them in the east in an attempt to try to restore elk to the area. So my job for my PhD was just to try to figure out why some of these reintroduced populations were doing good and some weren't. And what I found was that railways really seem to have an impact on the elk population. And this is just showing the same image I showed you with all the different wildlife. So I put up cameras to learn more about this, about elk specifically, but I found every medium to large mammal species was using the railway, and not just once or twice, but like kind of using it like a travel corridor. So I shared this with some of my First Nation colleagues, and people were saying, well, yeah, railways impact animals like crazy. You should see what happens to our turtles, which to me, I hadn't found anything in the Western scientific literature about railway ecology. And to learn this from community members, especially about turtles, because every turtle species in Ontario is a species at risk. So working with Magnetawan First Nation, we wanted to hear more insights from community members to learn the Indigenous knowledge that people were offering to share with us. So we spoke to elders and knowledge holders in both Magnetawan First Nation and Shawanaga First Nations, as both of these communities in Ontario had a railway bisecting the community. So one community member said to us, when you go down the highway where the railway is, you see skeletons of animals, especially heads, and you know they must have got hit by trains. And a lot of people were saying how wildlife was really getting hit by trains. Another person, Jerry Smith from Magnetawan First Nation, said, we find lots of turtles on the railway tracks. On hot days, those turtles step over the tracks. They don't even make it across the track. Sometimes they start boiling right on the track. They die within the tracks. So it's with this knowledge that folks shared with us, we said, we better investigate this with a little more detail. So we decided to braid the Indigenous knowledge that was shared with us with Western science to design this study, where we went on the railway and we knew, you know, this is when we should be looking, what we should be looking for, and where we should look. So we started doing these weekly surveys on the railway, having master student right now, Kyle Vincent, taking this on with Dr. Jackie Litskis as a co-advisor from Laurentian University. And we did find a lot of turtles, a lot of other animals as well, but turtles, which is something that we previously was not documented, that turtles were really getting hit by trains, sometimes getting overheated and unfortunately dying. We also found, many small mammals, frogs, snake, birds, and turtles getting stuck in sort of with the creosote on the railway, that sort of like a turtle tar, not ever previously documented, and very, very important to know. And the ties of railways can get 52 degrees. We did one summer when we were doing surveys, which is an average of 30% warmer than the air temperature, so a very hot environment. So this leads to a lot of questions like, how can we help our turtles? And we never would have known this without Indigenous knowledge and braiding knowledge systems to engage in this work. So again, talking about some of the cool wildlife experiences, here's a white-tailed deer that actually walked right up to me when I was out in the forest by this field one day, which is such a cool experience. I've had moose come walking right up to me. This big bull moose on the right was sitting around a bush, and I stopped with my ATV, and he came right around and he walked right up to me until he got so close. I was a little nervous, to be honest. I'm like, oh, you're big. And at the last minute, he's like, oh, you're a human. And he ran off, but he was gorgeous. And here's a female moose, a cow and her calf. And actually, moose are starting to decline on Turtle Island in many, many regions. And of course, many people are concerned. One elder, for example, at an event I went to with Nature United, a Cree Nation elder, said the moose just aren't calling back anymore. It's typically when folks go out hunting, you can call a moose and a moose might call back. So, working with Wiikwemkoong Unceded and later Shawanaga First Nation and Magnettawan First Nation, as one of the first projects that I engaged in as a professor, we wanted to investigate, communities wanted to investigate, why moose are declining, and wanted to have the ability to monitor moose populations independently, because typically the provincial government monitors on a large scale, but communities were interested in monitoring on a finer scale, traditional territory level. So we developed this moose monitoring app where people could go out and record the moose that they saw, which was really cool. And then in terms of understanding moose decline, we took a two-eyed seeing approach for this as well. So chatting with elders, Indigenous hunters, knowledge holders, and just to try to hear, to try to learn as you're on the land, like what are some observations that you see? What do you see happening to moose in your territory? And to do this, we attended a moose hunt camp, which I just have to share with you for a minute because it was one of the coolest experiences I've ever had. The moose hunt camp, actually, so this is with Wiikwemkoong Unceded, happens where the community completely shuts down for a week. People don't go to work in the community. Instead, they're at moose hunt camp, camping together and hunting moose for those who cannot hunt for themselves. So, for example, older individuals or disabled individuals or so on. So everybody comes together and helps. So hunters go out during the day, they hunt, and those who aren't hunting stay back and build relationships and keep traditions alive, culture and traditions alive. So for example, we learned a lot about traditional medicines, how to harvest and process wild rice, how to make birch bark baskets, how to use and respect every part of that moose. And then we learned so much by chatting with community members about, how are moose important to you, but what factors are related to moose decline? So we learned a lot, and that's sort of in progress right now. But one part of this work really made us realize that moose are important in so many ways as our relation. We respect the moose and we follow the honorable harvest. So harvesting and always respecting. And again, one way of respecting is using every part of that moose and recognizing that moose just aren't important for food. So as one of our relations, individuals share that yes, moose are important for food, but they are also important to help us build relationships like that moose hunt camp I said that people were attending for the moose. Important for knowledge sharing, teaching youth, material use, traditions, identity, and of course for the environment. moose are, like every one of our relations, are very important and deserve our respect and our care. So not only have I seen herbivores, for example, and worked with, I mentioned that I work with wolves, but also I see lots of bears out there, and I leave them alone, they leave me alone. And I found really with all these different wildlife experience that I have had, I've really realized that we can learn a lot from our relations if we watch and listen and respect. So never being disrespectful or getting too close, always being cautious, because these are wild animals. So I don't ever recommend people going up to wild animals, but being respectful. So for example, learning the teachings from the animals that we work with. When I watch Mukwa or the bear, I can be taught, for example, what berries can I eat, or I can learn how to be brave, because bears are show us, courage. And they also teach me, it's important to rest too. So seeing wolves, seeing this fox here, I love this fox photo. This fox was quite not shy, but again, you have to be always respectful and cautious, because sometimes animals can carry rabies. So you never want to approach a wild animal, just saying that. Lots of close encounters. So this was just really weird, a white-tailed deer that was just seemed to be so okay when I wasn't looking its way. But not just mammals. So I tend to come across, a lot of snakes and frogs, for example. I had to always watching on my ATV to make sure I'm not running anybody over. Turtles and learning from turtles too, as turtles can be our teachers. So for example, this Blandings turtle here on this log, which is a species at risk, teaches me to take a break sometimes. Don't work too hard all the time. Enjoy your surroundings and just sit in the sun and take in the environment and enjoy what Mother Earth has to share with us. Which just looks like this Blanding turtles here is just so happy. Birds, animals that you can't see. This grouse, for example, grouse teach me, so this is a ruffed grouse. They teach me to also be brave and incredible parenting skills. Ruffed grouse in the spring, the females will be on the ground with their offspring, and if you go by and their offspring are around, they'll run at you and hiss, and you're such a little small bird, but so brave to protect their young. So always when I'm out there, listening to the teachings that wildlife can share with us and being respectful. Lots of large birds too, like a sandhill crane. And here's actually a sandhill crane baby that I came across one day, the one on the right, so cute. The one on the left is a killdeer. It was actually caught in a piece of fishing line that I had to unravel from it. This beautiful merganser with all her chicks on her back, and even insects. So every aspect of the environment is equally important. So even down to the smallest insect or bacteria, beautiful species and relations everywhere, including the landscape. So we definitely can't forget our plant relations and landscapes around, which can be breathtaking. So with all these animals, plants, land, this is what I have decided to devote myself to ensuring that these landscapes and relations are around for future generations, for my kids, for their kids, for your kids. And working together is how I feel is the best way to do that. So someone told me I could never be a professor while I had kids. I had kids when I was in graduate school. I have 2 of them today, and I am a professor. So, and here's one of my children, Hunter, who often joins me to do field work. Here we are in Wiikwemkoong, and we were searching for snakes, and we found quite a few. It was really cool. And sometimes I will even bring my my dog with me. This is Leva, and she loves to join me on my ATV and can find wildlife too sometimes. So there she is with a snapping turtle. So you gotta be careful. So it can be really fun. Indigenous environmental science, wildlife ecology can be really fun, and I think that we need a lot more Indigenous environmental scientists to help, address some of these major environmental issues facing us today. So for me, this has been an incredible journey, something many people I think I had along the way tell me that I just couldn't do, but I never gave up. And I will never give up on believing that we can work together, we can engage in reconciliation, and we can better tackle some of these environmental issues facing us today. I think that we can, if we engage in two-eyed seeing or weaving knowledge systems in a good way, we can build some incredible partnerships founded in reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. So co-monitoring, co-research, co-management, for example, collaboratively, we can work towards reconciling ways of knowing for the environment. So to close here, I just want to say science is a place where I belong, despite what anyone has said, and it is a place where you belong, despite the fact that we all see things or do things differently, but that's what makes us so special. And that's what science needs more of. So science is a place in which we all belong. Miigwech, thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Popp, that was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your work with us. Your work is very inspiring. The way that you share it is very inspiring. And I love to see all of this incredible work happening around Turtle Island, but especially around the area that I get to live and enjoy as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. We have quite a few questions we can go through here in our Q&A. I'll get to the first one here. How did you decide what field of work to go into?
So growing up, my mom, who is Anishinaabe, used to take me out to the forest all the time, and she would actually teach me medicinal plants, and we would always be out collecting plants. And I used to always wonder about the animals. Like I would see trails or little sides, and I said, oh geez, I would love to look into that. So that kind of sparked this interest. I from a very young age understood that you needed to have respect and responsibility for the environment. And I always wanted to ensure that place that I always found solace, that I loved going out with my mother, that helped provide it for us. And I wanted to ensure that I could contribute to protecting it. So I kind of always knew that. It wasn't until, I was growing up and learning more about the need for Indigenous knowledge systems to be included, embraced, equally valued, that I really said, well, if this is a way that's going to help protect this environment that I love so much, this is something we need to do, that we should be doing anyways. So I kind of knew most of my life what I wanted to do. But thank you for that question.
Do you have any suggestions or tips on what looks good on university applications?
On university applications, I think, trying to think back to when I was applying to university. I think when you're in high school, there can be a lot of distractions and things maybe sort of pulling you away from your studies and schooling, but to always try to keep focused and remain positive, and thinking that no matter what anyone tells you, you can make it through, but just to keep always trying, because I think universities do have criteria that people need to meet to be able to get into university, and one of those, for example, is grades. So you just always want to make sure, I guess, that you're trying your best to maintain those grades. And if you need help, I guess they would reach out to people. I think, I don't know, Amber, do you have any comments on that one?
Yeah, that's a complicated one for me, because I always share my story of I never graduated high school. And so I wrote my GED and ended up attending university through a bridging program at U of T. And I've always been passionate about biology. If I could have chosen sciences, I would have. But in Ontario, we don't really have any bridging programs that help students get into the sciences who don't have those backgrounds. So it really is about, maybe going back and focusing on those science courses for now. And personally, volunteering is always a great option as well. But spending time with people who are doing similar things that you want to do is always helpful.
Yeah, really good point. Not many people know this about me either, but I was in a similar position. So I didn't finish high school. I went to adult education after. So everyone has a different experience. And if for any reason, like you don't finish high school, you don't get those grades, like just never give up, because there are many routes that you can take to eventually get into university. Like no matter what, I'm telling you, like if you work hard enough and you will eventually get there if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Okay, here's another one. As a student in grad school currently, how do we indigenize our thesis and help with decolonization at the institution from your experience?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So I would say we need students to voice interests and needs to decolonize the institution. So institutions are definitely moving in this direction, but with more encouragement from students, more and more will happen. Maybe things will happen more quickly. So a lot of times in universities, like if you want to learn about things like I shared about today, but you're not learning about it from a class that you think maybe should be able to share that, you just talk to that instructor and like just wondering, are you ever going to talk about Indigenous knowledge systems, and get that in people's minds and to think about that, well, maybe I should. So every one of us is an important actor in change and reconciliation. Just by asking a question plants a seed, right? We're all planting seeds. In terms of indigenizing thesis, I think that in the past, things haven't, like I said, things weren't done correctly. There was, not meaningful engagement. People would try to extract knowledge. So the way that I try to approach work now is if you are thinking about, taking a two-eyed seeing approach, to work with communities first, to build relationships, to learn and to listen, and to see if you can help with any projects or research that communities might need help with, for example, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm doing this research project and I want Indigenous knowledge. That's not a good way. So maybe potentially, a thesis that someone's working on now, that wouldn't work, but in the future, thinking about in the future, the type of work that you want to do, like definitely thinking about maybe doing some research on what a good way means, what respectful engagement is. So yeah, and again, we're all important actors in this. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, you're so right. And that is a really important question to ask. And I'm all about uplifting all of the incredible work happening in our communities across Turtle Island already. So, okay, the next question is, did you create a plan to help the turtles, or is this still in progress? And I think this is in terms of the railway study that you were talking about, because that's when this question popped up.
Very good question. So we actually just wrapped up. So Kyle Vincent, the master's student working on this, just wrapped up his surveys in Maganawa and Chewaniga First Nations. They're still going to continue monitoring, but so now he's going to do the analysis. And part of that analysis, he's actually going to look at with some Western science tech approaches to look at if there's hotspots. So where are turtles dying more than they would randomly? So probably they could be getting stuck in certain spot. Maybe some parts of the railway will allow turtles to escape, but others won't. So we're actually looking at that right now. We hope that the next step of this work will to help the turtles and other animal species too in developing what's called mitigation plans. So how can we hopefully work in partnership with the railway company to develop strategies that will maybe allow turtles to escape, because they get stuck in between the railways there, and that's why they get hit or they overheat. So how can we help them escape? And there could be some really easy ways, like maybe just digging out from underneath the ties, for example, but again, something that we have to work with the industry, with community. So lots of moving parts, but still in progress, and probably can share more in the future as this project continues.
That is exciting. It's always exciting to learn new ways that mitigation for these animals is being discovered. The next question is, how do you balance research, work, and rest?
Oh, this is my favorite question. So thank you for this question. Oh, I would love to talk about this. So when I started out, academia can sometimes involve a lot of hard work, which is fine. I found that at one point I was working too much, and actually I decided I need to stop and rethink things, because I don't have a work-life balance that I would like. So actually, this is part of my life right now this year. I've been spending a lot more time on the land and learning from the land, learning from our teachers. And so some of the examples I gave today was, learning that you should take a rest. Like our relations, like some of our relations, you see like wildlife, just sitting there soaking in the sun, like the beaver. Even the beaver is such a busy worker, takes a rest, sometimes, and enjoys the environment. Rest is very important. So having a work-life balance, always prioritizing yourself, your mental and physical health is incredibly important. So for me, I'm learning more and more how to do that, and different strategies for different folks. So I personally just, to make sure to prioritize things that I love doing, although keeping in mind, you still have to work hard, but you have to play and rest hard too. So I am spending a lot more time in the forest doing what I love, because that's why I got into this, my connection with the land. And so yeah, different strategies for different folks, but the important part here, I think, is to really emphasize, to always emphasize and to prioritize your work-life balance and your mental and physical and health in any work that you do.
Absolutely. Okay, and then we have one more question in the chat, and if anybody else has questions, please feel free to pop them in now. So this question is Indigenous burning traditions important for the environment? If so, how?
Yeah, of course. I don't know a lot about burning practices, but I do know that historically Indigenous folks in many regions, nations used burning traditionally to I guess alter the environment in ways that would. So burning, for example, can if you burn like shrubs or understory, for example, that can increase productivity to trees. It might attract, you might have new growth, so you're attracting wildlife. So you can actually completely change environments and productivity using burning practices, and this can be very important for certain environments. Like burning is natural in our environments. There are some species that rely on those early successional environments, like moose, for example, really love coming into environments that have been burnt, because they love those plant species that come up first, which are different than those plant species that are come up later after a burn. So yes, so that is a form of Indigenous science, and it is very important for the environment. I don't know a whole lot more. I know I have seen some headlines come by with Indigenous people still practicing traditional burning. But yeah, I would recommend taking a look into that, because there's likely to be quite a bit of information out there. Sorry, I can't answer that too much more.
Yeah, it's one of those things that popped up, and I was like, well, I often talk about it in terms of Toronto ecology specifically, because there we have, I lived in Toronto for 15 years and spent a lot of time working there. But at High Park in Toronto, they have one of the last standing Black oak savannas, which require controlled burns to be able to survive and thrive. So that knowledge is now in place there, but part and parcel because of a partnership working with communities like Alderville First Nation, which also has a Black oak savanna, and Walpole Island First Nation, because they've been practicing controlled burns forever, since time immemorial. So yeah, there's lots of really incredible research happening on all sorts of different fronts in different communities. And it's really nice to be able to share those things and bring them up. And yeah, really encourage people to look for that work happening and ways in which you can help to like amplify that work that's happening out there. At this time, it seems like we don't have any more questions. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Just like to say thank you to you, Amber, and to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this. It was just so wonderful to join you, and to the audience, to everyone who showed a bit of interest, and maybe to invite you to, so we were talking about, seeds of knowledge, and to invite you to, maybe take something you learned from here, or spend some time learning a little bit more and share those seeds if you can with others. Because it's only together that we can, plant enough seeds to make this big change that we sort of need. So, Miigwech, thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Miigwech, thank you so much. And on behalf of our team at Studis and SciExchange, we were thrilled to have you here. And we'll get this recording up so folks who were not present live can watch it later. And as I press end on this, it is going to boot all of us out of here. So a huge thank you again. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge. Miigwech, Bamapi.